for different audiences. Okay, so first, in my role as a professor, I'd like to start off with a quiz. So let me see if I can see this little window in front of some of my text, so I'm trying to move it around a little bit. Okay, so ask yourself this question. People following directions with illustrations, what percentage better do you think they do than those following text directions alone? So if we were in an audience here, I would love to hear your responses. Of course, a webinar is a little bit different scenario. But the correct answer is 323%. This was by a 1982 paper. So we can really start to see how and why a lot of the artifacts that we have out there in the world, especially related to communication, are done in a highly visual way. Now another pop quiz question. What percent of the population do you think are data literate? And we'll define data literacy as the ability to read, understand, create, and communicate data as information. Okay, so the response to this is 17%. This was a 2017 survey done in Europe. The numbers do get a little bit better when we look at a US study of C-suite leaders, but still this number of only 32% classified as data literates, that's a little bit worrying. I do think we can all agree that data should be made visual. This starts to get more people on board with understanding the information. I like to use this example from Edward Tufte, where we have these 4 different sets of data. And if you can look at this, especially some of you analytics people out there, maybe you can look at this and see instantly the patterns that are happening. For me, I'm a highly visual person, and I look at this, and the thing that first stands out to me is all of these point zeros, which of course we know is the least significant part of the number. I also see in the 4th data set here, 8.0, a bunch of those, so I know something's happening there, but I can't quite picture in my mind what that is. Of course, when we graph these data sets out, we can much more quickly start to see the patterns. Excuse me. We see the patterns and we see the outliers. So we have a much clearer idea of what's happening with the data. I do have this sort of cheat sheet that I often hand out in presentations I give. If you want to email me later, I can send you a PDF of it as well. This is a kind of cheat sheet that I use to help people better understand what type of graph to use when. And it's based on what's your objective, what do you really want to communicate to people. We do know behavior science tells us that data alone is not enough to change people's behaviors. A lot of my work has to do with communicating social and environmental sustainability, and I would say that health is a core part of social sustainability as well. Doug Mackenzie Moore, in his book Fostering Sustainable Behavior, says that the diversity of barriers which exist for any sustainable activity means that information campaigns alone will rarely bring about behavior change. So in just providing the information to a group, an audience, will not necessarily change their behavior or sway their opinion in any way. We need to engage emotions. Dana Zant from Share This says that facts and information alone don't activate the emotional centers of our brain that cause us to take action. And even Plato, our good friend, has said that human behavior flows from 3 main sources: desire, emotion, and knowledge. So if we think about knowledge as being information that's shared out and information that's kind of applied, then we really need to focus on how do we approach the emotional aspects and the motivation. So when we think about this, establishing this connection that's needed for social and environmental sustainability, we have to think about, well, what are some of the existing things in the world that touch on our emotions? There's film, music, art, and stories. There's research done that actually talks about how a story activates parts of the brain so that the listener turns the story into their own experience. So if I hear a story about a child being hurt in a car accident, I really feel that on a very personal level. I mean, my heart aches because I imagine my own child potentially being hurt in a car accident. So stories are a really great way to start to put data and this information that we know doesn't motivate people's behavior change, to put that information into a larger context. I think this particular cartoon is a great kind of showcases the two sides of this, where we have the more technical scientific person saying, oh, we have this great indicator that measures ... And this is, where a lot of the current data analytics lives. I think that we as very technical people get really excited with this idea of this indicator and this measurement. And isn't this great? And the numbers are telling us everything. And on the other side of the equation, we have another audience who's saying, yeah, but I need to understand how I can relate to this story. So, or this data, tell me a story. So to try to bridge these two different mindsets, we do know data should be visual. We covered that earlier. Data should tell a story. And so let's talk about this as being data visual storytelling. So I want to talk a little bit more specifically first before we go down that road of combining data and visual storytelling. First, let's do a little more digging into visual storytelling itself. Now, visual storytelling is not anything new necessarily. Stained glass windows from the Renaissance era and earlier were not just to make the light look nice as it came into religious buildings, but to remind illiterate parishioners of the stories that they were being told during their visits to the religious facility. Other examples, cave paintings have been around over 17,000 years. So this is a visual language. And a lot of them really seem to indicate to visual stories. Now, there's a lot of research still being done on these of what is that story? Is it an offering? Is it a request for a better hunt? The story is, at this moment, sort of eludes us, but there were clear visuals attached to this that have survived eons. And of course, the example we already kind of touched on a little bit of airplane safety guidelines. Now, it's interesting, I have a student who recently looked at the history of airline safety guidelines, which of course we know airline safety guidelines in general have changed over the years, fortunately, for all of our health and safety. And also they've become a lot more visual. So the reason for this, of course, being that often when people are traveling, especially to different countries, there's a whole lot of mix of people that speak different languages, potentially on the same flight. There's also people of different reading abilities, different ages, from young children to the elderly. And so the pictures really start to show that story in a way that words alone cannot. I like to talk about pictures are really great to provide context, where words and numbers can get quickly at the details. And you need a bit of both. And this is an example from a illustrator slash comic artist, Chris Ware, that I really enjoy his work. He really looks at exploring different timelines throughout the same page. If you look closely in this very complex visual, you see the lives of people. You see them growing up, how they maybe meet each other, get married, what their life is like, what their grandparents' life is like, how they moved around the world. So you can really start to capture a lot of that context with visuals. Here's a detailed shot of it a little bit. Okay, and of course, when it comes to visual storytelling, I think this is one of the predominant visuals that's used. Again, this is also nothing that new in the history of time, but this is Napoleon's march to, or attempt to go capture Moscow in 1812 to 1813. Now, we could, instead of having this visual, and I'll go a little more in depth in this visual here shortly, but we could present this information in another way, right? We could focus on the data component of it. So let's have a headline here, Napoleon's 1812 campaign to capture Moscow. And we can start with, well, soldiers at the start and at the end of the campaign. So we can see here that, well, this is information visualized, but it's just one portion of the overall story. And you can see that, well, something happened here. I mean, clearly not as many, very few soldiers returned compared to those that started off on this campaign. We can even start to add another data point in here of, well, clearly the start and the end of the campaign doesn't tell the whole story. So how about on the other end of the visual, soldiers arriving and departing Moscow? So now we see that that's close to being approximately the same number, and it's still significantly less than started the campaign. So now we start to get a picture of, all right, something else. This gives us another piece of information, but we really need to fill in the story to make this a more compelling and interesting argument. So this visual, and this is where I wonder if I have a pointer here. I don't know that I do. On the left-hand side, you see the soldiers in a beige bar. These are the ones departing or entering into Russia. And you see their journey, the path they take across the countryside. And in the upper right-hand corner, that's Moscow. So you start to see the number of soldiers that made it to Moscow. You see that's approximately similar to the number of soldiers in black. The black bar is the retreating soldiers. And you really start to see both the route that they take, also the numbers of soldiers that, well, are dying, basically. They're not surviving. What's really interesting about this particular visual is that it combines so many different variables. I think there are about 5 different variables in this one visual that really start to show the story. As an example of this, across the bottom, I think I'll zoom in here, across the bottom, you see a temperature scale of, and this is a different temperature scale, degrees Reaumur, I believe it is. I probably slaughter that pronunciation. But you can start to see how it got very, very cold. And this particular, here in the center of the screen, where the soldiers are fording a river, you can really see very quickly how the temperature was extremely cold. I want to say it was about 14 below or so in Fahrenheit, and many of them did not survive. So you really start to get a more clear picture of what was happening with Napoleon's attempt on Moscow. That it wasn't necessarily the battle that killed these soldiers, but it was the journey, it was the extreme temperatures. Okay, so let's transition to a little bit happier subject. Most of my work here lives in this intersection between sustainability, information and data, and visual and emotional stories. So I really seek to establish that connection, an emotional connection with individuals on the social, environmental, and fiscal aspects of sustainability. As an example of this, we can look at how can we start to connect people to the everyday, to their daily actions, and to their big picture impacts on the world. How do these daily actions impact the world? Let's take our coffee that many of us drank this morning. We can start to show the backstory of that coffee. By showing these things, it really helps us start to understand, see the invisible aspects of everything. As another example, we could take this simple pencil. And this could also, we could replace the pencil with anything, basically. But we can start to look at, well, the wood in this pencil came from a tree. This tree was grown in a specific location, cut down with a specific method. And there's a whole network of systems behind the harvest and the logistics of how this tree was processed into the wood for the pencil, how it was transported, and even behind that are the people. So there are people throughout every step of this whole larger system. And that really is what can form a complete story. If we leave people out of the equation, then it's harder for us to relate to it. We're very social creatures, and so we like to understand how people relate to these larger concepts. And of course, this particular story that I just told you was just about the wood of the pencil. So there are other materials on the pencil. There's the paint, there's the metal. I learned recently that's called a ferrule, I believe it is. And then that's the metal bit is what attaches the eraser as well. Within this, now interesting enough, when it comes to social or more environmental sustainability, we have a lot of eco-labels that exist that start to show, they start to talk about specific parts of this overall story and kind of certify them as being more environmentally sound. And I think these have been a really great tool, eco-labels, but they don't go the full way because they don't talk about the full story. They highlight specific parts of that story. So FSC certified wood, for example, is one part of the story. Fair trade is referring to the workers and the labor force. Energy Star is referring to the electronics that go into the use phase of this particular product. So all of these things are one piece of that larger story. And I like to see how we can start to combine all of those things together. And of course, recycling can be the end of use and or the packaging. So a famous environmentalist, John Muir, has said that when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the entire universe. And I think this is a really interesting concept and one that informs a lot of my work, trying to think about what are the ways that this seemingly small piece of data or project, what are the ways that it connects to the larger world around us and to individuals around us? Another piece of information, inspiration for my own work, is the designer of isotype Otto Neurath. And he has said that words make division, where pictures make connection. And I think we see this a lot in, well, in anyone that's trying to get anything done on a policy level, of we can sit around a table and argue over the exact words and the phrasing of those words. And sometimes when we're, and the words are important, again, as I said earlier, for details. But when we get to, when we don't need those details, when we need a general overarching agreement on a bigger concept, sometimes pictures can set that up in a more clear way. Now, if any of you aren't familiar with Otto Neurath, he's the designer of isotype, and here's an example of some of his work. He sort of created a visual language, and I think that was in the 20s or 30s. I can't remember exactly the time frame. But his work has really informed a lot of designers throughout this time. Okay, so I want to transition now to talk a little bit more specifically about some examples from my own work with background stories. Our aim with background stories is to communicate complexity to non-experts in an engaging way. So these non-experts can range everywhere from the general public to other stakeholders of a project. So it's very audience specific how we work. We do a whole variety of information graphics, data visualization, visual stories, animations, and we just really try to build off these principles of behavior change and to communicate social and environmental sustainability. Here's a handful of the clients we've worked with. And now I want to talk a little bit about, so I'm going to go through 3 different sections. Some examples of our work. I want to talk about our process, because I think hopefully this can help you in your own work. And then at the end, I'll talk about some tactical tips of frequent questions I get and things that my students are always asking about, as well as when I give presentations. Okay, so we'll start with some examples. So these are in, I think we have 3 different categories here. The first category is about showing stories. So this is an example of literally a visual story to remind people that water doesn't just come out of the tap and disappear down the drain, but that it has a whole life before that and after that, and that it's a cycle, the water cycle, but also how that interfaces with our industrial cycles. Another visual story. So this is showing the story of a particular company that has developed special yeast that combined with harvest materials or agricultural materials creates a fermentation process that then becomes purified, and then the results of that are different biochemicals that can be used for a variety of products and or animal feed. So you notice here that this is a highly proprietary process. The fermentation and purification are sort of general categories of that process. And we don't get into details of exactly what that fermentation entails or the purification entails. But on a higher level, we can start to show the story more easily. We've done some work with the city of Minneapolis on their 2040 comprehensive plan. So this is a plan that cities in this area every 10 years have to do an update to their plan that's looking 20 years into the future. And so we worked with the city on some communication materials to sort of set up what are the objectives for this plan and to invite input from citizens in the area based on this information, based on the plan. And here's another project that again shows a story. This was an installation in the airport, in Minneapolis-St. Paul Airport. It's since been taken down. I think they're renovating this area, but it was a collaboration with Xcel Energy, and we sought to show the backstory of where our electricity comes from, hanging over 3 different tables, and this is part of the cafeteria area or food court area. So when people sat down at 3 of these tables, the lamp above them would light up, and it would light up 1/3 for each table of the backstory from where the electricity came from. So generally this idea of the more electricity we use is the more that has to be generated. And another project for a client that does bamboo houseware products. This particular visual story showcased or was for a biodegradable product that they have. And it shows the backstory of the product. So how it's grown, how it's manufactured, where it travels from, what happens during the use phase, and also that it can be composted, with the idea that this is actually a continuous cycle. So we use this in exhibition materials, and the composting then leads into soil for new plants. In this case, we highlight that being more bamboo, so this cycle can kind of go on infinitely is the general concept. And within this, you'll notice that we have input specific areas where the eco-labels make sense based on which part of the life cycle of that product are they attached to. And this is a little more complex example of a story. This is for the European unions. They have a regulation process that came out, and this is trying to visually show the steps in that process and the different feedback mechanisms involved. So again, this is not necessarily for a citizen audience. It's not necessarily for the general public, but for other organizations and people that sort of participate in this process, advocacy organizations, et cetera. Okay, the next section I want to show some examples about is giving numbers context. You'll start to notice there's a lot of overlap between these things, but I think these titles of showing stories, giving numbers context, and then the third one are all things that can really start to inform your work in showcasing the context of data. Okay, so this is a simple bubble chart. And to give these numbers context, these are different workshops that are held around the world for sustainable tuna fishing. And in the background, very lightly, you see sort of an abstract globe. So you start to get a sense of, these dots on the map are not placed in an exact way, but it's an approximation, and it starts to give you a sense of what the organization wants to show, which they really have this global coverage. Here's another example of putting numbers into context. So this is numbers on organic product production and also retail market for organic products in Europe. So this is an interactive map where we have this information in the context of the visual of Europe, and it can be explored by the user. And we did another version very similar to this, but for another type of sustainability, circular economy, and that's another interactive map. Okay, this is an example. I'll go into depth a little bit more when we talk about process, because I think this process might be really interesting to all of you. This particular visualization is for showing social return on investment. So we have a nonprofit here, Better Futures, in the upper left-hand corner. This is the nonprofit being featured. This is a project we do in collaboration with an analytics team called Ecotone Analytics. And they do all of the analysis of the numbers, and we help them visualize it to help it show and tell the story. So Better Futures works with formerly incarcerated individuals, so after they get out of prison, and provides job training and a secure work environment, basically. So there's a cost to that program. You see that in the lower left-hand corner, cost per participant. And then in the middle column, you start to see what the estimated return on investment is based on all of these technical different categories. And then on the right-hand side, you see who benefits and how these benefits then translate across. The benefits to the taxpayer translate across to what percentage of those benefit the local municipality, the state of Minnesota, in this case, the organization is based in Minnesota, and the federal government. So you start to see, previously, later on in the presentation, I'll show you what we started with this, which was basically just an Excel spreadsheet of data. And so this really starts to show the story in another way that people can hopefully relate to a little more directly. And this is a personal project I've been working on, which takes information from the International Panel on Climate Change's assessment reports, which are hefty documents. So we take some of the visuals from that. This one is global mean sea level rise. And we start to showcase across the bottom here how that relates. We overlay the lifespan of an individual across the bottom. So in this case, we took a child born in 2015. How old will they be by 2050? and then by 2090. One of the problems I think with these big picture concepts such as climate change is helping individuals understand how that relates to the human scale. So when I think of 2050, I have a hard time saying, we're not very future focused as humans. So we have a hard time understanding, well, how old will I actually be, or how old will my children be in 2050? And that really takes a mental calculation. So if I happen to know a child, my own child was born a few years before 2015, so I can start to better relate to how others will be impacted by these global events that happen in a long-term duration. Okay, and this, I think, is the last category I have of different examples. And this is about integrating information and also doing that in a physical context. So most of the work, I've showed a little bit of a mix of things that are digital or poster-oriented or interactive-oriented, and some of the previous examples have been more of a physical thing. We get really excited when we start to have the opportunity to do these physical installations, because I think it really allows people and audiences a different way of interacting with information. Where we're so used to being inundated with information on our laptops and on our phones, putting information in context can really start to get at another, makes us pay attention in a different way. So this project was in Malmö, a neighborhood in Malmö called Vastrahamnen. And this neighborhood was built, I think it was in 2001, with a lot of environmental and social sustainability principles integrated into the neighborhood. Now, walking through the neighborhood, as these images show you, you get a sense of, oh, this feels like a different place, but you don't necessarily understand what's happening behind the scenes. So I collaborated with a team that made these periscopes, so these devices that you can look through. Inside this device that you look through is a computer, and the computer, of course, knows which direction you're looking and at what part you're zoomed in on. So we showed, this is kind of quasi-augmented reality visual of behind the scenes of all of these things. So the viewers, what you see when you're looking through this is actually a very small percentage of these visuals. These visuals here on the screen show you a complete 360-degree view. But you start to be able to see how you can explore different components. So if I see, look into the house and see there's heating and cooling, then I can trace those things down and across the image to underground aquifers and geothermal capabilities. You can also look at the electricity in the home and trace the cord across the landscape to 3 kilometers away. There's energy coming from a wind turbine for this neighborhood. So this starts to show you what's happening behind the scenes of this very place that you're standing in at the moment. Of course, this can also be done with a cell phone app. Some of our work is also putting signage directly out there in the world where things are happening. This particular project was for an underground water catchment system, and a very high-tech system that was installed in a high school here in the Twin Cities. And we're starting to show what's happening behind the scenes of this system, because you wouldn't necessarily see any evidence of anything from the surface. There's also an interactive sort of timeline associated with this system. So on some screens inside the gymnasium and the school building and next to the field, it shows you what percentage full is the tank currently, how much water is there, and how much can that water the field, and what's that water equate to. So whenever we have really large numbers, for example, 16,623 gallons, that's such a large number that we lose context of what that number means. So providing another context, for example, that's the equivalent of what could fill 2.4 school buses, and this is in context of where people are viewing these screens, which is around a school where there are a lot of school buses circulating. That makes sense. Certainly, if it's in a campus in another place that's not serviced by school buses, then school buses would not be the appropriate analogy to put that 16,000 plus gallon number into context. Okay, this is another project where I did an artist residency in Sweden. as well as the previous one I showed you. I was really inspired by these bicycle counters that were around the city. And the counter here, I have this little window that's in front of my screen, so I know it's 5,000 plus cyclists that have passed this point in this particular day that the image was taken. And I was interested to, well, this is a powerful number, 5,000 something, but I wanted to see more about what does that actually mean? What does that translate to? So I did two versions of this project, one in Malmo, and then what you see on the left-hand side here, this is a research paper based on the Twin Cities area or the Midwest. Within this is specific data about cities in the Midwest, including Minneapolis, St. Paul, the Twin Cities. So based on, we did one of these projects in Sweden, and I'll show you more images about the project done in the Twin Cities. So this is where we installed a bicycle counter in various bike paths throughout the Twin Cities. And we had a projection under bridges in places where it's dark and also at night, showcasing how many people, how many cyclists have passed there that day, and what that translates to in terms of savings based on based on health and clean air savings. So in this example, 827 people cycling have passed here today, and they have saved society $8,270. There's also in this image, you can see sort of a blurred cyclist image. That's part of the animation that as each cyclist passes, that shows up, and each individual cyclist, I believe they save something like $2 per trip. So it shows that as well. And then on the left-hand side, it's also showing the gallons of gasoline saved. So with this interactive project, there's the capacity to, not only are people viewing the information in context as they're going about their daily activity. Excuse me. But you can also start to integrate other fun little things. So for example, when the gallons of gasoline saved equated to a barrel of gasoline, and we had this little barrel sort of excuse me, drop from the top of the screen and animate and then slowly, gradually disappear. Okay. And another sort of physical-oriented project. This was done, as you can see here, the images are all from, this is a nighttime art exhibition that takes over the city. And this particular project, we developed a survey. So this is a survey of 5 questions. These questions are attached to trees. It's a Likert scale. So each question is attached to a tree, and there's a Likert scale on it. You see in the right-hand image. And we had participants select a color of yarn based on their age range, and then string that through how they responded to these 5 different questions. And these questions, the theme of the event was related to climate. And so the questions were also related to climate. So what was really fascinating about this is we expected, this is basically a survey. So we expected some participation, but there was a line. People would wait in line for 20 minutes all night until close to 3 a.m. The event, I think, stopped at 5 or 6 a.m. So until about 3 a.m., there was a line of 20 minutes waiting time that people would wait there. Excuse me. When there are plenty of other creative events going on, but they would wait in line in order to answer this survey. So of course, it's Likert scale question, and at the end, they had the opportunity, if they wanted to leave a more qualitative note at the end of their string, they could do that. So over time, you really start to see this pattern of people's responses, and as well as the individual can locate their own thread within this larger system. So I think this analogy for people is really quite powerful, and maybe something that we often don't get as individuals, and especially as survey participants, that we want to see, well, how do I compare to everyone else? And how is all of society and understanding our differences between us as individuals, as well as areas that we start to have some similarity of thought. This project was then recreated in a few other locations as well, hence the daylight photos here. And I think this is the last project I'll show you. This is a series of showcasing the Minneapolis College of Art and Design students throughout the history of the college. This goes back over just about 100 years. And each felt ball represents one student, and they're color-coded by the department that the student, or the major of the students. So you start to, over time, see the ebb and flow of students as well as different majors. Okay, so we're getting a little short on time. I'm going to zoom through some process things. This image is also available on our website. This showcases the process that we use when we're working with clients. I'll note here the green check marks are showcasing the client input. So I think it's really important to have the stakeholder buy-in and throughout the whole process and have that open, really open communication channel. We start off everything with just rough sketches because the minute you put something into the computer, people interpret it as being final. So pencil sketches are the first way to go. I'm going to skip over this project here. This is back to another project that I had mentioned earlier, the Better Ventures Social Return on Investment visual. And I'll run through very quickly the process for this. This is the data sheet that we started with. I sat down with the person who developed the data sheet, and we talked about, I really wanted to understand what's the story within this data. So here's some notes related to that. I started my sketching, started exploring the data, and kind of landed on this idea of a Sankey or flow diagram, sometimes also called alluvial diagrams, would be a good way to start to show the flows throughout these different categories. Plugged that into software, and of course this is a custom Sankey, and went through various iterations. Each of these iterations are then kind of reviewed together with the client. So we have that open communication channel. And in the end, we have this template that we use for a lot of different projects to showcase their social return on investment. Here's some of those examples. Okay, so now into tactical tips. A lot of people ask me, well, what type of image should I use? Should I use a photograph or an icon? And I would say, well, photographs get very specific very quickly. So someone may be able to identify with this tree, or they may say, I grew up in a region that did not have green trees like this, or maybe a more desert region. And so they may not be able to relate to that image. So when you're seeking to convey a general concept, icons can be a good way to go. If you're seeking to showcase a specific case study or a specific individual story or specific example, then images are a great way to showcase that. So I have another example here, but I really want to get to questions, so I'm going to skip through this. Here's another tactical tip. It's all about the audience, so make sure you're really clear on who your audience is. I consider the elements to a good visual story, including the information itself, the story, a goal, which is also directly tied to the audience, and the visual form. That could be the graphic design. Okay, another tip. People often say, what media should I use for visual story? So here's my guidelines on that. If your aim is to explain or tell a story or make something shareable, an infographic is a good way to go. A data viz is important when you want to show the data specifically to support a larger story or a larger message. Interactive allows people to explore the data or different scenarios at their own pace. And an animation is a step-by-step kind of forced walkthrough, and that's really good to introduce complex concepts. Okay, so I have some resources here. You're welcome to come back to them. And I run workshops as well, so if that's of interest to your team, feel free to reach out. So with that, I'll open it up for questions. Looks like we have about 12 minutes for questions.